In the summer of 1862, a Union Army surgeon named William Williams Keene watched a soldier die from a wound that, by today's standards, should never have been fatal. The bullet had missed every major organ. The man should have walked away. Instead, infection consumed him within a week. Keene didn't know why. Nobody did. He had trained at one of the finest medical schools in America. He had studied anatomy, memorized the names of 1,000 bones and vessels, and could perform an amputation in under 2 minutes. And yet, standing over that soldier's body, he was no more equipped to save him than a doctor from 1,000 years before. For most of human history, the person you called when you were dying knew almost nothing about why you were dying. They knew rituals. They knew herbs. They knew how to cut, how to bleed, how to pray. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the real killer was often invisible. A universe of microscopic organisms was deciding the fate of empires, and no one on Earth could see it. This is the story of the people who stood at that boundary. The healers, the surgeons, the physicians. For thousands of years they held life and death in their hands while working almost entirely blind. Some of them were geniuses. Some were frauds. Some killed more people than they saved and never knew it. And buried in their mistakes is one of the strangest, most human stories in history. Because it isn't really about medicine at all. It's about what happens when people are desperate to explain suffering and willing to believe almost anything that promises an answer. Kings depended on these people. Armies collapsed or survived because of them. And yet, until shockingly recently, the profession we now trust with our lives was operating on theories that were, quite literally, poison. Why did it take so long to figure out? That story begins nearly 5,000 years ago in the shadow of a Mesopotamian temple, long before anyone used the word doctor. Someone in a Sumerian village was already being asked to explain why people got sick, and the explanation they landed on shaped the next 4,000 years more than any single medical discovery ever would. They believed illness was punishment. Not from germs, not from bad luck, but from gods, demons, or broken taboos. A fever wasn't a fever. It was a spirit that had entered the body and needed to be driven out. This idea sounds primitive today, but it solved a real problem. It gave people an explanation for something terrifying and uncontrollable. Suffering made sense if it had a cause, even an invisible one. This belief created two separate professions almost simultaneously. There was the Asu, a kind of practical healer who used herbs, poultices, and basic surgery. And there was the Ashipu, a priest-exorcist who diagnosed illness through omens and treated it with incantations. Clay tablets from ancient Babylon list hundreds of prescriptions alongside spells, treated as equally valid tools in the same toolkit. A patient might receive a genuinely effective plant remedy and a magical chant in the same visit, with no distinction made between the two. Here's what almost nobody expects. Some of those herbal remedies actually worked. Willow bark, used for pain, contains a compound chemically related to aspirin. Ancient healers had no concept of chemistry, yet through centuries of trial and error, they had stumbled onto real pharmacology. They just wrapped every success in supernatural explanation, because that was the only framework available to make sense of why anything worked at all. But there was a darker side to this system, and it would echo for millennia. If illness was punishment, then the sick person had often done something to deserve it. Hammurabi's famous law code, carved in stone around 1754 BCE, includes some of the earliest known regulations for doctors, and they were brutal. A surgeon who saved a patient's eye with a successful operation could be paid handsomely. A surgeon who failed could have his hand cut off. Imagine practicing medicine under that threat. Every incision was a gamble not just with a patient's life, but with your own body. It's not hard to see why so many ancient healers preferred spells to scalpels. A failed incantation carried no such penalty. Thousands of miles away, in Egypt, something remarkable was happening that would not be matched in scope for over 2,000 years. Egyptian doctors were, by any honest measure, centuries ahead of their neighbors. They had specialists. One inscription describes a physician who treated only the eyes, another who handled only the teeth, and another who cared exclusively for what the ancient text vaguely calls the belly. This kind of specialization wouldn't reappear in Europe until the medieval period. The reason had everything to do with a practice most people don't associate with medicine at all: mummification. To prepare a body for the afterlife, embalmers removed and examined internal organs constantly. It wasn't intended as science, but it functioned as one. Over generations, this repeated, hands-on exposure to human anatomy gave Egyptian healers a working knowledge of the body structure that surpassed anything achieved by cultures that never opened a body at all. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, an Egyptian medical text dated to around 1600 BCE but believed to copy material 1,000 years older, reads almost shockingly modern in places. It describes 48 surgical cases, and unlike Babylonian texts, most of them are analyzed through observation rather than magic. The document describes symptoms, offers a prognosis, and in several cases bluntly states that a condition is untreatable, an admission that a magic-based system would have found almost unthinkable. And yet, in the very same culture, in the very same era, another text, the Ebers Papyrus, prescribes remedies involving crocodile dung and recitations to ward off demons. Egyptian medicine wasn't purely rational. It was something stranger, rational observation and magical ritual, existing side by side in the same physician's toolkit, often within the same treatment. This contradiction is the key to understanding almost every ancient medical tradition. These healers were not stupid. They were pattern-seeking, and sometimes their patterns were built on genuine observation, and sometimes on superstition, and they had no reliable way to tell the difference between the two. A remedy that worked by coincidence looked exactly as valid as a remedy that worked by chance recovery. It would take a culture obsessed with argument and observation to begin, however imperfectly, pulling those two threads apart. Around 400 BCE, on the Greek island of Kos, a physician named Hippocrates and his followers made a claim that, in context, was almost radical. Disease was not caused by the gods. It had natural causes, and could be understood through observation of the body itself. This is often taught as the birth of scientific medicine. It wasn't, not quite, but it was a genuine turning point. The Hippocratic writings introduced ideas that still echo today: the importance of diet, environment, and lifestyle in health, the value of careful, patient-by-patient observation, and an ethical code, echoed in the modern Hippocratic Oath, that explicitly forbade doctors from harming their patients. But the theory the Greeks built to replace divine punishment turned out to be almost as wrong, and it would prove far more dangerous. It was called humorism. The idea was that the body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health depended on these four humors staying in balance. Too much of one humor, and you fell ill. The cure, logically enough within this framework, was to remove the excess. This single idea would go on to justify bloodletting for the next 2,000 years. Think about that span of time. A theory formed in Greece around 400 BCE was still being used to treat patients in the 1800s. On soldiers, on presidents, on ordinary people with fevers and infections that bloodletting could only make worse. George Washington, dying of a throat infection in 1799, had roughly 40% of his blood drained from his body by physicians trying to restore humoral balance. He almost certainly would have survived the infection. He did not survive the treatment. Why did such a flawed theory last so long? Because it was internally consistent, intellectually satisfying, and almost impossible to disprove using the tools available at the time. If a bled patient recovered, humorism was validated. If a bled patient died, the illness was simply judged too severe, or the bleeding not thorough enough. The system could absorb any outcome and claim success. This is a trap that would catch medicine again and again over the coming centuries. The Greek physician Galen, working roughly 500 years after Hippocrates, cemented humorism into something close to unquestionable doctrine. Galen was brilliant, and much of his anatomical work was genuinely accurate. For the animals he was actually dissecting, Roman law forbade the dissection of human corpses, so Galen built his understanding of human anatomy largely from pigs, dogs, and Barbary macaques, then assumed structures would transfer directly to people. Some of his conclusions were dangerously wrong as a result, and because his authority went unchallenged for over 1,000 years, so were the doctors who followed him. That unchallenged authority was about to collide with forces no ancient theory could explain. For centuries, the biggest threat to any doctor's theories wasn't a rival philosophy. It was catastrophe on a scale no humoral chart could account for. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe, and it exposed, in the most brutal way possible, exactly how little physicians actually understood. Doctors of the era believed plague was caused by miasma, or bad air, sometimes originating from unfavorable planetary alignments. Their solution was to burn aromatic herbs, carry flowers, and in the most extreme cases, don the now iconic beaked plague doctor mat, its beak stuffed with dried flowers and spices meant to filter the poisoned air. It didn't work, because the actual cause, a bacterium spread largely by fleas on rats and in its pneumonic form through respiratory droplets, had nothing to do with smell at all. Somewhere between 1/3 and half of Europe's population died over the following years. And yet, strangely, this catastrophe planted an early seed of real epidemiology. Officials in Venice, watching ships arrive from plague-stricken ports, began requiring incoming sailors to wait 40 days before entering the city. They didn't understand germs. but they had noticed through brute observation that isolation seemed to slow the disease's spread. The word they used, quarantina, is the origin of quarantine. Religion, too, reshaped medicine in ways that cut both directions. In medieval Europe, the church funded and staffed many of the era's hospitals, preserving classical medical texts through monastery scriptoriums when much of that knowledge might otherwise have been lost. But the church also restricted human dissection for long stretches, out of concern for the sanctity of the body, which meant anatomical knowledge stagnated for generations even as surgical need grew more urgent. War, meanwhile, became an unlikely engine of medical progress, generation after generation. The sheer volume of trauma forced advances that peacetime medicine had no reason to pursue. Ambroise Paré, a French military surgeon in the 1500s, ran out of the boiling oil traditionally used to cauterize gunshot wounds during one battle. Improvising, he applied a gentler mixture of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine instead. The wounded men treated with his makeshift salve recovered, noticeably better than those who'd received the standard boiling oil treatment. Paré had accidentally discovered, through nothing but battlefield desperation, that the traditional cure had been actively harming patients for centuries. Then trade routes did something no single physician ever could. As ships connected continents that had evolved in near-total medical isolation, they carried more than silk and spices. They carried diseases into populations with zero prior exposure and zero immunity. When Spanish forces arrived in the Americas, smallpox moved ahead of them, in some regions killing a majority of the population before conquest was even complete. It remains one of the deadliest events in recorded history. And it happened almost entirely because two isolated disease ecosystems collided at once. Each of these catastrophes forced physicians to notice patterns that pure theory had missed. But noticing a pattern and understanding its cause are two very different things. And one profession was about to demonstrate just how wide that gap could be. Buried inside this long, often grim history are individual stories that feel almost unbelievable, and one of the strangest belongs to a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis. In the 1840s, Semmelweis worked at a Vienna hospital with two maternity wards. In one, staffed by midwives, roughly 4% of new mothers died of a fever contracted after childbirth. In the other, staffed by doctors and medical students, the death rate was often 3 to 5 times higher, sometimes far worse. This made no sense. The doctors were more educated. They should have produced better outcomes, not catastrophically worse ones. Semmelweis noticed something the doctors themselves had missed entirely. Those same physicians often went straight from performing autopsies on cadavers to delivering babies, without washing their hands in between. He had no concept of germ theory. It didn't exist yet. But he suspected the doctors were carrying some kind of invisible cadaverous particles from the dead to the living. He ordered doctors on his ward to wash their hands in a chlorinated lime solution before touching patients. The maternal death rate on his ward immediately collapsed, dropping to a fraction of what it had been. By any reasonable standard, this should have been one of the great medical triumphs of the century. Instead, Semmelweis was mocked by his peers, who found the idea that a gentleman's hands could carry death to be personally insulting. He was eventually dismissed from his hospital position and, in a tragic final chapter, died in an asylum from an infected wound, of the same broad category of illness he had spent his career trying to prevent. It would take the work of Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, roughly 2 decades later, before the medical establishment finally accepted that invisible organisms, not bad air or moral failing, were the actual cause of infection. There's a quieter, stranger story hidden in ancient India as well. Physicians there, including the surgeon Sushruta working around the 6th century BCE, developed techniques for reconstructive nose surgery, rhinoplasty. In modern terms, using skin grafted from the patient's own forehead. The technique was developed largely because amputating a criminal's nose was a common punishment in the region, creating consistent demand for reconstruction. Sushruta's method, refined over centuries, would eventually travel to Europe and directly influence the birth of modern plastic surgery over 2,000 years later. And then there's the strange story of what doctors got right almost by accident. Ancient Chinese physicians practiced a technique called variolation as early as the 10th century, deliberately exposing healthy people to material from mild smallpox cases to trigger immunity. They had no concept of the immune system. They simply observed, generation after generation, that survivors of a mild case rarely caught the disease again. That single observation, refined and adapted over centuries, would eventually cross into Europe and inspire Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine, the very foundation of modern immunology, built from an idea nobody involved could actually explain. These weren't isolated flashes of genius in an otherwise ignorant field. They were the same pattern over and over, careful observers noticing something true decades or centuries before anyone had the framework to understand why it was true. By the late 1800s, the pieces finally started coming together. Pasteur demonstrated that microorganisms cause disease. Lister applied that discovery to surgery, introducing antiseptic techniques that made operations survivable in a way they simply hadn't been before. For the first time in human history, doctors understood, even partially, what they were actually fighting. It's worth sitting with how recent this is. Humans practiced medicine for roughly 5,000 years, and for more than 95% of that time, the people doing the healing had no accurate understanding of what caused the diseases they were treating. Germ theory is barely a century and a half old. Antibiotics are less than 100 years old. Measured against the full span of medical history, modern medicine is not the culmination of a long, steady march of progress. It's an extremely recent and fragile achievement, built on the ruins of theories that dominated for millennia and were simply wrong. And yet, that long, strange, often tragic history isn't just a record of failure. It's the record of how humans have always responded to the same terrifying problem: suffering that has no visible cause. Long before anyone could see a bacterium, people still tried to help each other. They organized knowledge, however flawed. They passed it down. They argued, revised, and occasionally, almost by accident, stumbled onto something true. The soldier William Williams Keene watched die in 1862 didn't have to die that way. Within a few decades, the same wound, treated with an understanding of infection that barely existed in his lifetime, would have had a real chance at survival. Keene himself lived long enough to see germ theory transform his profession, and he later became one of the pioneers of modern neurosurgery, operating using antiseptic techniques that would have seemed like sorcery to the physicians who trained him. That's the real story, hidden inside the history of doctors. Not a straight line of progress, but centuries of people working in the dark, guided by theories that felt certain and were often catastrophically wrong, slowly and painfully getting closer to the truth. The next time you sit in a waiting room, or take a course of antibiotics without a second thought, it's worth remembering what that certainty cost to earn, and how astonishingly recent it really is.